You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals, not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Okay, so welcome back to Fire University. Today, I wanted to talk to everybody, those of you who are private landowners in particular that may not be experienced or you're interested in starting to use fire. We're getting a lot of feedback from you guys, and it's pretty obvious that there is some interest in using fire, but there seems to be some barriers to getting into the use of fire, and we really wanted to focus this episode on that issue. If you're a private landowner and you're interested in using fire, but you never have or you haven't very much, what can you do about that to start using fire and get into using this practice to meet your management goals? So I have two people here who have an immense amount of experience working with private landowners on exactly this thing. So I have John Gruchy here with me and also John Stivers. So I know recently we had two Kevins on and we made a few jokes about that. And now we have two Johns on. So not sure how that's going to go, but I'll try to refer to you guys by your last names if I can. But I really appreciate you guys coming on to talk to us about this.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Glad to be here.
We could go ahead and get right into it. I get emailed a fair amount, I would say, from private landowners who are just interested in the use of fire and what can it do for them on their property. And most of the people that contact me are generally interested in managing wildlife, in particular game species. But some of them are forest owners and are interested in managing for timber production or things like that. What would you guys tell people if you get that question? I'm sure you get it plenty. Why would people want to consider using fire on their property?
Well, this is Stivers. The way I would couch that response would be with the basic definition of what prescribed fire is. It's a safe way to apply a natural process and ensure ecosystem health and reduce fire risk. So when you think about that, those 4 points, it's safe, it's natural, functioning ecosystems and reduce wildland fire risk, then it dovetails into resource objectives. Are you burning hazard reduction? Is it site prep for natural artificial regen, wildlife habitat improvement, timber stand improvement? All of those reasons kind of help you focus so you can, move in an orderly fashion as far as planning and metrics and prescriptions.
Yeah, and I would second that. I completely agree. The thing I would add, I guess some of the landowners that I work with, maybe they're not ready for fire yet. We'll talk about fire, and I've actually been accused as a wildlife biologist of referring to fire like pixie dust. The foresters say that wildlife people talk about fire like it can just be sprinkled over the land and make everything better. But there's plenty of landowners that we go and talk to and say, look, fire is not the first step here. Maybe there's a resource concern or there's a fuel concern. There's something going on that maybe fire is not for you today, but depending on your objective, maybe fire could be worked in.
Yeah, when you think about sequencing your treatments to be effective, you're absolutely right. Burning just for burning is the wrong way to go. What's your desired future condition? maybe you need to throw a timber cell in there first, or maybe do some mechanical. There are other surrogates for fire, but at the end of the day, you want to have an orderly, sequential way, and fire should be part of that solution, but it might not be the first step, but that's part of the planning process. Let you know when fire needs to roll in.
And then I think after that, we start looking at what level are they going to need fire to meet that objective? Is it going to be a one-time event, or is it going to be multiple events over multiple, one-time event per year maybe, or multiple events per year? And then you start looking at logistics. Is that something that you're going to want to contract out? Is it something where you're going to want to provide that service yourself? From an economical standpoint, do you have the ability? Do you have the capability to apply that fire yourself, and the tools and equipment and all those things, like we're probably going to talk about later on?
Sure. I think that's a good point, and it provides me a good segue. It sounds like there are quite a few considerations that people need, and that's some of the feedback that I get is that it isn't always obvious what those considerations are or where to get that kind of information and experience. So I know you guys work with people to do this a lot. Where can people find that kind of information when they're interested in doing this?
Well, I would start with, professional people, consulting foresters, certified biologists for starters, and obviously forestry commissions, DNRs, game and fish commissions, universities, extension, NRCS. I mean, there's this whole range of others, but I think the first crack out of the box should be a forester and or a biologist, because we have not just the education. I mean, we've got the experience, and I think we can zero in much quicker than these other sources. They're important, but you need to get it from experienced people. Not to knock extension or somebody else, but I would definitely start with certified foresters, registered foresters, particularly since we're talking about fire. Southeastern states, I would make sure that the person you're getting your advice from is a certified professional burn manager. Otherwise, you can go to the Spit and Whittle Club and get all free advice you want, but you're dealing with certified prescribed burn managers. I think that, adds much weight.
I think that's a good point. And coming as an extension specialist that's in the university, in academia, I do quite a bit of research on fire, but I'm not lighting fire nearly as much as you guys are. And having someone that has that day-to-day experience getting out there, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, I would second what John is saying. Also, it's very different from area to area. So we're in the Southeast, he and I, and we're going to talk extensively about consultant foresters. Both of us are probably have gone to forestry school at least. In the Southeast, if you're a wildlife biologist, you went to forestry school. But if you go west, obviously we're going to be talking about rangeland. It's going to be a different group of professionals potentially. So you just kind of get started, where exactly to start. Generally, it's a good idea to start with your kind of the local professional and then start learning from there. In my state, state forestry actually has the legal jurisdiction over prescribed fire. In some states, that's the Department of Ag and Commerce. It just depends on that state. But then, like John said, making sure that you vetted the people that you're going to take advice from.
Yeah, good points. So playing off of that same idea there, a lot of people are interested in getting their own training to eventually, I guess, get experience enough that they are that person, right? That they are comfortable pulling their own permits. So what kinds of training do people need to consider, and what is available to them?
Well, again, it depends where you are. And again, I'm focused on the Southeast. I'm a, certified burn manager in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And not all states, particularly in the country, have right to burn legislation or prescribed fire councils, et cetera. But to me, that's a good example for a template for the rest of the country. But it starts with, if you can attend a certified burn manager class, even if you're not going to do this for hire, just to have the wisdom, the knowledge, go to prescribed fire council meetings, get around people, practitioners, and particularly landowners. I mean, as a consultant forester, I love working with landowners, and nothing would make me happier than see them dropping the match and not using me. I mean, I burn 25,000 acres a year on private land in 2 states, and I can only be at one place at one time. So I like to see them get their confidence up, help them build a capacity, and we'll talk a little bit later about, well, how do you ease into it? You just don't get it. But in the meantime, get on as many burns as you can, but start with that burn manager class. Go to any kind of learning burns, live fire opportunities, even just looking at webinars, Southern Fire Exchange, all of these resources are out there. Pictures worth 1,000 words. You might not actually be boots on the ground, but watching videos of seeing how people are performing ignition, different methods or different firing techniques, even if you're not there, you can learn a lot from just videos and pictures. So to me, there's just all these opportunities to help a person get that experience, but nothing beats, stick time on the ground. So when I for my clients, I always just say, look, it doesn't cost any extra. I'd love you to come out and see what's going on. And most of them do.
Yeah. I think same thing kind of in Mississippi. We have a little bit of a different structure. Maybe I think Alabama, Georgia, Florida have really like John mentioned, kind of the standard, the gold standard on fire certification courses. Mississippi, we were actually one of the first fire certification courses. Our Burn Act goes back to 92, but we haven't really updated it, if you will, and we don't have, certainly for the technological age where we've got continuing ed options and that kind of a deal. But basically what we're looking at is trying to have introductory stuff through extension and state wildlife. And I know, Marcus, when you were here, you actually went to one or two of those things and even spoke at a couple of our little events as an extension person. Basically go into some of those extension events as kind of an introductory, a tasting, just a little bit of a test and see, whether fire is appropriate. And then we would hope from there, the goal of those types of events is to get people to go towards those certification courses.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And it sounds like, especially in the southeastern U.S., the states, whether it be the state agencies or other organizations or the university extension, are developing resources all the time, not only to get information to people and make it accessible, but also provide opportunities, it sounds like with the Learn and Burn, for instance, to actually go out and get experience. I know one thing that I've been working on here recently or prescribed burn associations, even depending on where the listeners are, there may be groups who have already gotten together in the community that are providing opportunities like that to leverage one another's resources and also leverage each other's experiences. So a lot of great opportunities out there. So I think it was John Stivers brought up something that made me think about the legal considerations, and this is something that is a barrier to a lot of people. They're afraid of lighting fire. Right? They're going to set something on fire and then have smoke that's definitely going to leave the site. So I was curious what you guys had to tell people about that with the legal considerations of using fire on property as a private landowner.
Yeah, and this is Stivers. I would suggest have a healthy respect. Don't be afraid, but don't be overconfident. Apply the science, and you got nothing to fear. Have contingencies, and it all really ties back to planning. If you just kind of think this through, you have to get the school, you have to get the science, particularly with smoke. Smoke is the thing that potentially is going to put you in a scary position. It's not the fire escaping the line. We can catch those all day long, but smoke is the thing that should get your attention. So, learn how to screen smoke, daytime, nighttime burns. Learn about smoke management tactics and techniques on avoidance, minimization, dilution, these strategies. And then if you apply those, and they're not hard, I promise you, landowners, you're going to have a good outcome. If If you think it through, screen your smoke, have cutoffs, contingencies, start early, some of these other things we'll discuss in a bit, you're going to have a good outcome. And then that's going to build your capacity, your confidence, but don't get too big for your britches either. It is an inherently dangerous sport that we do. And we make it look easy, but if you don't have a knot in your stomach, there's something wrong with you. And it shouldn't be the size of your fist, but you ought to have a little bit of a gut check. And always go to the Lord before you drop the match. Pray for wisdom.
Yes, sir.
And divine intervention if you need it.
Yeah.
Be confident.
Yeah. Well, and I just follow up with Stivers. A lot of landowners approach me with, ask about big liability concerns. And he's exactly right. The best way to limit your liability is to educate yourself and avoid. It's just like anything else. There's liability with driving a piece of heavy equipment. And the way we, limit that is to get certificate. You have to have a license to operate heavy equipment. It's limiting your liability. Then people immediately turn to the conversation about insurance, and insurance is simply paying somebody else to assume your liability. And there are opportunities for insurance, and landowners need to look into that if that's what if they are. Every individual landowner has different liability concerns, and I certainly don't want to broad stroke that or brush it off. I don't want to minimize or trivialize people's liability concerns. And Marcus, you mentioned PBAs earlier. We've actually worked with some groups to get group policies that have event fees and all that. That's stuff that could be talked about at length, but at the end of the day, the best policy is just exactly what John Stivers says. You can limit your individual liability by becoming a professional. And, there are steps in that process. You, just like anything, if you're going to be a blacksmith, you start as an apprentice, and then you have to be a journeyman, and then you're a master. That's the way it is with prescribed fire. The problem is, you can do the blacksmithing in your backyard, and if you mess something up, you can throw it away. There's a little bit more consequence to error, with the fire. So you've got to put yourself in a position to where you can be apprenticed in fire, and that's going to be a little bit up to the landowners to seek that out.
Yeah, and I've got a little wisdom here. It's a saying I always use, and it's simple, but it's straight on. It's not hard to be wise. Just something stupid and don't do that. Okay? Don't burn on the south side of the interstate, when the wind's out of the south is going to push it. So if you just think this through from because again, it's smoke. Don't burn with bad fire lines. Don't get in a hurry. Don't rush into it. If you do those things, you're probably going to have a bad day. But if you think it through and just work the plan, have those contingencies, you can build capacity and confidence, still be effective. So be wise. Think of something good, don't do it.
And the other thing John has mentioned that he and I both, I guess, are so used to it, we kind of gloss over it, but the plan. So that's a huge part of it. I think a lot of landowners may not even be familiar with that. In my state and in most of these states with prescribed burn laws, they're actually required by law to have a burn plan that has specified components, and it is notarized ahead of time. So the plan, we keep referencing the plan because it's kind of, I think, second nature to he and I, but that's also a big part of the liability concern. You actually have to sit down and write out and plan a fire. It's not something where you wake up on a Tuesday morning and go, looks like a good day today. We've clearly laid these things out, written them down. Not a plan is not written on the back of a cocktail napkin. It is actually a legitimate, sometimes we've spent, and I know certainly in the federal government, there are people that spend 8 months at a time just writing fire plans, multiple fire plans. So that is, the plan is also a key component of limiting your liability.
So that's a good point. And I wanted to follow up on that. So what are the steps if a private landowner wants to implement a fire? We obviously have some planning that needs to lead up to that process. And it sounds like part of it is seeking out information. Part of it is developing this plan. I know there's also opportunities to get training and become a prescribed burn manager, at least in some states, right? So can you walk us through, either of you that want to walk us through, what are those steps that a landowner would take to make sure that they limit liability under these laws?
Well, just in general, and again, the written plan, it doesn't have to be some onerous thing. It just forces you to think this through. But when you get down closer to game time, you want to make sure you're familiar with the property. You've picked your containment lines. You're going to put in a dozer line. You're going to burn after this road, this creek, this passive line. Inspect those lines in advance, particularly streams. Creeks can go underground, go below ground, or you could have a drift of debris where fire can creep across. So think about your boundaries. Where are you going to burn to? Inspect those. Make sure, and don't get cheap. If you're going to put in a good dozer line, put in a good line. Those are capital investments. If you're going to burn maybe on a 2, 3, 4 year return interval, do the work to put them in where they're not going to wash away, because you're going to be reblading them in a few years anyway. But containment lines is very important. The other thing I would encourage landowners, I do this myself. I burn some very, very large tracts. And when I'm out there dropping in my fire lines, I'm going to go ahead and put in some cutoff lines. I'm going to sweep a road in the middle. I'm going to just break it down. I might burn the whole thing in one sitting, but if I have to stop because of humidity or wind changes, or half the crew has to go home to get their kids out of, in school or whatever, you have a way of cutting that burn off. You eat an elephant a bite at a time. So if you just, through planning, think about your boundaries, cutoffs, contingencies. What am I going to do if this happens? Well, I'm going to contact this VFD. We'll have those phone numbers, have those contacts. So John and I can't stress enough about just planning. And you can, again, just write these down to where it forces you to think. And then you won't have any surprises. Surprises are really nice on your birthday.
Oh, that's right. No, man, I agree with all that. In Mississippi, we actually have 4 steps that are required to, for our sake, we actually have the right to burn, as John mentioned earlier. We have right to burn state in Mississippi. So as a citizen, you have the right to burn your own property. However, if you want liability protection under our Prescribed Burn Act, you have to have 4 components, 4 boxes checked. One, it has to be in the public interest, which is, whatever that's, generally that's going to be true for most of our fire. I suppose that would eliminate the people that are trying to burn, maliciously, I guess. You could follow all these steps and have a malicious fire. But the other 3 are very important. The certified prescribed burn manager. So you have to be certified by the state law. You have to have a written burn plan notarized at least 24 hours before the fire is lit. And then you also have to pull a smoke permit. As Marcus talked about, he keeps saying, he's mentioned pull a permit. Every state has a different process, but in the state of Mississippi, we call them burn permits, but they're really a smoke permit. And you have to call our state forestry on the day of your fire, or they will issue them, on weekends a day ahead. But essentially you have to call on the day of the fire and get a permission to light, and they give you a window a time window of when you can have that fire lit and when you have to have it extinguished. And that is purely for to manage that smoke when it gets off site. And so if I have all those boxes checked and I go on the morning of the fire and we've got all dressed up and we have our plan ready and everybody takes off work and they show up and I call and I don't get my permit. Now, usually I have looked at the weather a day ahead and I know whether or not I'm going to get a permit. But if we call that morning and they say no smoke permit, we all got to go to work. We got to go home. We can't light matches. So, those are the type of, again, that's also a further liability protection. We're not going to light a fire on a day when the weather conditions are not conducive for good lift and getting the smoke up out of the, away from the highways and smoke critical areas.
So to go back to what Stivers was saying and connect that to what you just said, Gruchy, if the conditions aren't such that they would issue you a permit, it's probably not a smart decision to be lighting anyway, is what it sounds like.
I don't think those two things are not, I always stress those two things are not exclusive. They will absolutely give you a permit on a day you better not burn.
Right, but I notice I said it the other way.
yeah, that's right.
If they won't give you a permit, it's probably not a day
that's
that
right.
you should be burning anyway.
Yeah, because the bottom line of liability is negligence. And this is really easy for landowners. Negligence just means, would a reasonable, prudent person do what you And I always just say, if you can't look your mom in her eye and keep a straight face with what you plan to do, you probably ought not to do it because you're going to get whipped. So have the discipline to stop, have the discipline to know when things are, going tango lima, and that's where these contingencies and cutoffs, and you cannot be found liable because you did what a reasonable, prudent person would have done. I kept my lighter in my pocket today, or I cut that thing off at 10:30 in the morning and contained it at 40 acres instead of 400, where I knew I would have smoked in an area. So that's the bottom line. It's just negligence. Don't be negligent, and you'll survive that all day, every day.
So it sounds like, at least in Mississippi, based on the burn laws, just we'll keep with that example. If you have gone through the trouble of becoming a prescribed burn manager, or you have one on site, right, and you have a management plan or a burning plan where it includes the wind directions and wind speed, mixing height, and all the weather variables that are correct for burning a particular spot, and then you get a permit to burn on it, then you have a lot of protection if something goes wrong from that liability. Is that correct?
Well, in theory, there is some legal protection there. That's not been challenged. Better for us not to go deep into that, I guess. But essentially, there is some legal protection there for a private landowner. But the world we live in, we're in a very litigious society, as we say. You can be sued for crossing the street the wrong way. You know what I mean? So it's not saying that you wouldn't potentially, face litigation if there was an incident. But when you've done all of those things, you've covered your bases, and essentially you've made it what we would say a defensible. Is this defensible? And that goes back to the reasonable and prudent. Exactly, the exact language that is in our burn laws is reasonable and prudent. So, yeah.
So it at least makes it really difficult to prove that you have gross negligence.
We better not get into that. We're getting deep into that then. Yeah.
But not to beat it too bad, Alabama's had the right to burn law for 25 years. We have burned between 22 and 25 million acres with prescribed fire and have not had the first legal challenge. So it works.
Yeah.
So being certified, applying that, being confident. I just look at like there hasn't been one auto in 25 years and 22 to 25 million acres of treatment in Alabama yet. So these 4 steps, and ours are very similar, they work. So if you just do that and don't do something stupid, you got nothing to worry about. It's a false fear.
Yeah, I think those are good points. That I know, even as being a private landowner, that's something that worries people. And like you said, if you take the necessary steps, respect fire, but you don't necessarily need to fear it. And there may be a lot of reasons why you'd want to use it to get some things out of it you may not be able to otherwise with other management approaches. So to circle back around, we were talking a few minutes ago about putting in fire lines and having a dozier and that sort of thing. A lot of landowners, I get this feedback pretty often, a lot of landowners don't have that kind of equipment necessarily, or they may be trying to burn on a budget. Let's just say, this is obviously not the time to not take our precautions like we've just been talking about. But what are the minimum tools that a landowner would need to engage in fire?
Well, for starters, obviously, a drip torch, you don't have to have a drip torch, but for 150, 175 bucks, and they last forever, that needs dropping matches and flicking picks. A simple rake. I like forced air leaf blowers for lifting litter out of roads, so you don't have to get a dozer per se. So a forced air blower that will knock the hair off a cat, get a good one, 50-mile-an-hour wind, and you can get those for a couple $100. Maybe the next step is ATV, if you've got that, or a buggy with some water handling capability. Then whatever you're comfortable with. If you want to go full NWCG, Nomex, get yellered up, that's $600. Tell your wife that's what Santa Claus can bring you. It's necessary, but back to the containment lines, you don't have to own a bulldozer. You can get the state, you can find consultants and contractors that'll put in lines. I mean, that's what I'm doing right now. I've got 27 properties, 110 miles of fire line. And I wait till the leaves get off and I do all 27 tracks at once. It takes about 2.5 weeks. And now I'm cocked and ready. So I get all my lines in. I know where they need to be. I know which roads and creeks I'm going to use. So a landowner can do the same thing. Give it to somebody else that's doing the work. It's like tree planting or aerial spraying. Nobody's going to come in and spray your 22-acre clear cut just because it's there. But if you can bundle that with these vendors, then throw you into rotation. So do the same thing. So don't worry about, if you need a good dozer line, there's no reason you can't get that done, and you don't have to invest in all that. But the basic, a torch, a rake, an air blower, some water handling capability, I think that's really all somebody needs for starters. And again, extension universities, there are ways you can borrow a torch or borrow a rake or things like that. It's got to be creative.
Oh yeah. On the subject of equipment, I would say just like I do with almost everything, my answer is it depends. I have landowners who can literally head fire it to the ditch. You know, they have their property is shaped in such a way that there are roads and creeks, and they can just, all they need is a torch. You know, and one guy in the right wind. On the flip side, I've got some landowners that have large tracts, and when you have large tracts and you don't have big crews, I want huge fire breaks. I also work with the state land a little bit, and you know, it's not uncommon for us, staff limited. We may try to burn some big tracts with 4 or 5 people, but when we do that, we're going to have 20-foot fire breaks, and they're going to be bare dirt. You know what I mean? We're going to put the time in. The staff limitations are utilized during, you know, putting in the breaks. You know, we're going to use the time ahead of time, and then when it's go time too, we do that. Sometimes we want to be able to get as much done as we can when the weather is right. So we'll put those big, good breaks. I have some landowners that don't want to do fire breaks because they don't want to recover them. And that's understandable. You know, you don't want the bare dirt. There's weed issues there. There's a lot of problems associated with that. But if my name's on the permit, I like bare dirt, and I like as much bare dirt as your time and energy will allow. And, you know, that's another liability limitation there. And then that helps me be able to go fast. If I'm going to be able, and I don't mean unsafe fast. It just helps us from having to have multiple people watching the lines, having spots, having all this stuff. It also broadens the conditions we can burn. You know, generally, if I've got poor breaks, I've got a person that I work with that does not believe in disc. He'll mow fire breaks. Well, that works because I can only burn on 60%, you know, 40%, 50% humidity. When we get into the 30% humidities, he's out. There's no way that's not going to happen. So, you know, I would keep all those things in mind again, it goes back to, it depends. What are your goals and objectives? If you are a person with a quail plantation and you're going to have 30 burn events every year or 15 burn events every year, you might as well drop the coin on a good disc or a fire plow or a tractor, a dozer. But if you are a landowner who is just trying to suppress fuel, you're worried about your neighbor who burns a lot, and you want to make sure he doesn't burn up your pine stand, maybe you can contract that out, a one-time event, or you can get away with a little less equipment and just make sure you're watching those conditions. If you have the ability to burn on those specified conditions when the fire is less volatile, then maybe you don't have to put as much into your brakes. It just really all depends on your individual situation.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Another thing that I would add when I'm working with landowners, I know that you guys probably experienced this. A lot of times they're really interested in burning because of game species, their game species interest, and that fire break often can be a really good food plot. And a food plot can often be a pretty good fire break depending on what's planted in it and what time of year it is. So, you know, there's opportunities that could open up. You could potentially even use features. I like what Stivers said earlier. If you're creative, you know, you may have a lake or the yard or some roads that you could leverage. You could allow those natural features that would be a natural break to help you decide where you're going to put fire and how you're going to do it.
long term, most stuff with prescribed fire, I tell my clients, it's like, don't start something you're not prepared to finish. This is not a one and done treatment. We're going to burn on a 2-year return interval. A lot of these guys are after these savanna conditions where we do timber sales, fuel wood, rotation release to get that weedy 4B insect producing understory. And if you're going to go to that expense and it's like, really, you want to get cheap on a $175 fire line, put them in the right spots. They're easy to maintain. But again, it goes back to, you just have to tease this out of them up front. But there's things you can be efficient on, but you want a 7-figure O and lawsuit, or you want to stroke a check for a little bit more and have a good, decent fire line that'll hold fire. And again, make us more productive, where we can light off more ground, less patrol, less holding. Time is money. So if we got to go slow, you think you saved on a fire line, you're backing up. It's going to my labor costs per hour. I'm worth a lot more than so I can go really, really fast. And but most of them, once you explain it, they said, "Yep, do what you need to do," because they do not want to have a bad liability issue come back on them, and they're in the chain of liability anyway. So
Sure.
you got to kind of walk them through that, and then you're good to go.
Well, the other thing I've noticed when we start talking about this with landowners is, what good is a piece of property that you can't access? And so when we start this conversation about infrastructure, fire breaks, it always circles around to roads too. And it's like, man, you really need a road there anyway. What if we got to get the truck in there? What if we do have an how are we going to get the truck back here? How are we going to suppress this? And so it all is interrelated, especially for those, working with private landowners is really no different than working with big tracts of public land. We spend a ton of time on public land with infrastructure, roads, and it's all for this very reason. We need to be able to get to every acre of that property if something goes wrong. And so those are always conversations that come out, whenever we're starting to talk with landowners. They don't have equipment, they don't have this. And again, I'm not trying to be intimidating. I know the people that might be listening may be just getting into this and getting started, but you got to start thinking 5 and 6 moves ahead. What's my 10 years, next 10 years, what's my next 15 years look like? So
we're very respectful of landowners and their objectives, but you have to remind them sometimes, you saw us out, listen to the wisdom of the professionals. And a lot of times, if they want me to do something that's really on the cheap and I know it's going to cause problems, I say, look, I can't do that. My good name is not going to be associated with shoddy work. So sometimes you might just have, and that's happened once in 18 years of consulting, where I just have to find somebody else. I can't do that.
So with that being said, I think that's a good segue into the other thing. You guys both have so much experience working with private landowners. I was curious if there were other things that we haven't talked about that are either commonly overlooked by private landowners, or things that you think are important to stress before we conclude the show.
I'll get my licks in real quick. For any landowner that's just beginning, and even if you're in the middle or have a lot of experience, these are things that I would continue to do. Make the time. Attend prescribed fire council meetings. Go. Install, maintain good fire lines. Bomb-proof brownies. Take advantage of those passive roads and creeks and things like that. Begin with backing and flanking fires to kind of ease you into it. Don't start with some ripping head fire. That always makes them wet their pants. So start easy. Use backing fires, low complexity burns. Start off with light fuel loads. Don't tackle something that hadn't been burned in 35 years, okay? Conduct good, thorough smoke screening for daytime and nighttime. You've got to know where your smoke's going to go. And that's not hard. It's just apply the science. And then lastly, and this is a little technical, but they would get this when they go to school. This will hopefully bait them. Burn when your 1 hour fuel moisture, those fine fuels, when it's between 8 and 10%. And I promise you, if you stay in that range, and most of them would say, what the hell are you talking about, 8 or 10%? Trust me, if you stay in that range, you're going to have a flame length that's less than 2.5 feet, running with the wind uphill. And it's going to have a rate of spread that's like 3 chains per hour. So to get started, go easy, use backing, flanking, burn with those moisture prescriptions, and kind of get a few notches in your belt, and that will build that confidence and capacity. And then you'll just get better and better. Some people have 1 year of experience. They've had it for 40 times. And some people have 40 years experience. So have 40 years of experience, not 1 year, 40 times. You've got to learn from every burn project that you're on. So ask questions, observe, record the weather, go back and look, and just apply the science and interact with professionals. And I've been doing this for 41 years, and I'm not done learning yet. That's how you start. Everybody has a start.
Oh yeah, I certainly agree with all that. My most critical piece of advice is really exactly what we started the whole conversation with, and that is to be completely clear about why you are burning. I find that's one of the biggest overlooked things. Like I talked about, sometimes people hear us on these podcasts, or they read something and they say, "Fire, yeah, fire, good. I'm going to burn." And then when we get to talking to them, you explain, why is this? Why are we burning? Then that changes a whole lot of the conversation. Then it becomes, how are we going to go about this? All those things that Stivers mentioned about fuel moisture, all those weather parameters and fuel parameters he's talking about. Once you realize what your goal is, why am I doing it? And you're very clear about it. It's not, I'm burning because it's good. Then that really changes it helps you answer every single other question that we've talked about so far. If your goal is to have a huntable population of bobwhite, I'm going to go about your fire discussion totally differently than if your goal is, if you have, and depending on the property, obviously, then if your goal is to, have large antlered bucks consistently, or if your goal is to be able to shoot 3 turkeys a year off your property. So this being absolutely and completely, it sounds like I'm making a big deal out of this. You would be shocked. I've gotten 3 years into a process before and talked with landowners, and they say, well, I really think I want this instead. I mean, you Marcus know some of those landowners. I mean, it's very frustrating for a wildlife biologist, but I also look back and say, I was not responsible enough to get them crystal clear on the front end. And maybe they didn't have all that information to know what they were embarking off into. So your most important tool is not of something you can buy or put diesel into or use on a fire line. It is absolutely knowing precisely what you want to do. Why am I doing what I'm doing? And then after that, I think the key is like I said, apprenticing yourself in fire, becoming a student of fire, becoming a student of wildlife, and understanding that that's not necessarily a one and done type thing. We kind of have the instant gratification society right now. I want to do something one time. I want to pour this out of a bag and walk away. We're talking about, a way of life here. This is a pretty good commitment. And again, don't want to intimidate people, because it depends on, again, what level of entry you are in this whole process. But I think the front end part is really the part that gets overlooked the most. And that's my opinion.
Yeah, that's interesting perspectives from both of you. Another thing for people to think about, in the interest of respecting fire and not necessarily being intimidated or scared of it, but respecting it. You don't necessarily, if you've decided that you have an objective that fire can help you meet, you don't have to apply that everywhere or to the whole property or at large scales. That you may have the opportunity where you have an old field somewhere, or a place right next to the lake, or something that just for whatever reason is more conducive to entering. That may be a way for you to start out and get some experience and have a little bit of leeway, just because you have a 40-acre lake on the back of it or something like that. It may be a triangle wedge in between the roads, that's only a couple acres. There are opportunities like that where you can start getting some experience and realize some of the benefits from fire, and realize whether or not you want to start applying it more widely on the property.
And like I say, look for contact professionals, build a team of professionals as well. That's the other thing. We talked about all these different sources of information. You don't have to just go to one or the other. It's a good idea to get a team of people that you can bounce ideas off of and get a bigger sample size, so to speak, for information. And so building your kind of habitat management team or property management team is very important. And then again, the key players there would be potentially a consultant, potentially, state agency type folks with forestry or wildlife, NRCS to help. We didn't talk any about cost sharing or any of that kind of stuff. We mentioned prescribed burn associations, but there are ways to start thinking about that. And then part of your property management team is also going to be your accountant. You need to kind of start thinking about budgeting and taxes and all that kind of stuff. So it's a drawn out process, and I think, I don't mean to be sound complicated about all that, but it can be at any level of entry that property manager wants to be.
Great points, guys. In the interest of connecting folks to professionals, how can they find you guys if they were interested?
Well, I'll give my email. It's not hard to remember. It's rxburning, as in prescribed burning, rxburning@aol.com. They can shoot me an email, and I'd be glad to help them. Because again, I have a passion for landowners. I was 23 years with the USDA Forest Service in Arkansas and the Ouachita, the Talladega in Georgia as a silviculturist, and I've been a private consultant for 18 years. So I've been doing this a long time, and these last 18 years just servicing the landowners is just so nice. Mainly, I don't have NEPA. That's always a real fun thing not have to do. Everything's categorically excluded, but just to help these landowners push these projects over the finish line and encourage them and motivate them. And again, the cost share. The second question I normally ask them is your income over $900,000 a year? And if it isn't, it's like, hey, we need to do these treatments to try and get you in line for some of these things to help them find a funding mechanism to not just do fire lines and burning, but maybe these fuel woods and mid-rotation release to get to the desired future condition much quicker. Because fire is part of it, but it might not be step one. It might be step 4. So just engage these professionals and then let us do the stuff we're really good at doing, and they'll be happy.
Good deal. Yeah, and my contact information is John JOHN .Gruchy GRUCHY at WFP. So that's Wildlife Fisheries Parks .ms.gov. And they're welcome to email me. I am the state private lands program coordinator for Mississippi, so I actually have 6 or 7 biologists that work with me, and we can actually do private land consultation for free. I'm sure whatever state they're a resident of has a private lands program that has biologists that'll come out and do free consultation. And then generally that's going to be an introductory level thing, and they can go work with. We almost always are trying to depending on the situation, working with private consultants, like John Stivers or forestry consultants, and occasionally even wildlife biologists. So
that's great. Well, guys, I really appreciate it. I think that was enlightening, and glad that you were willing to come on the show and tell us about your experience working with private landowners. I think this is a key part of it for people. They're starting, if they're listening to this podcast, they're obviously interested in fire and probably starting to realize some reasons they might want to. I think it's important to really talk about the process and what you have to go through. So I really appreciate you guys coming on the show to do that.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at NR_University.